It is good to see you all here and to welcome you for this last of the lectures of this Convocation year and the last Taylor lecture of the year. It is my honor to begin this introduction. Over the course of the last 3 days, we have heard Dr. Linda E. Thomas build on her work in theology and anthropology by focusing on South Africa and inviting us to journey with her to see what we can learn from the experience as we consider how we here in the U.S. can think about the aesthetic dimensions of a religiosity rooted in survival and resistance to declare, "We are here." Yesterday, she described the HIV/AIDS death trap against women with a question that was left hanging in the air for us. Is it also our death trap? And are we mere taillights that mark the flight from solidarity, or are we headlights that have the good sense and better acceptance of God's grace to listen for a good long while to our sisters from South Africa as they tell us finer points of horror, as they may also be the beginning notes of hope? Dr. Thomas embodies the finest of theological reflection by using the womanist lens to ask us, challenge us, dare us to look deep within ourselves by listening to the history, lives, and stories of folks who may not look like us, but are part of God's magnificent design in creation, and this makes them our kinfolk in the drama of salvation. All of us are the better for it, as she calls us to think through the interrelationship of culture and religion, and to question the assumption that what we know is all that there is to be known in the vastness of God's handiwork. From her years at Iliff School of Theology, Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, and now the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, Dr. Thomas has been an unapologetic advocate for rigorous intellectual engagement in the life of the Christian churches, and also serves as theologian in residence in her home church, the historic Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago, to challenge herself to prove it. Dr. Thomas is a womanist scholar. She engages in willful scholarship that wants to know more and in greater depth than is considered good by traditional theological speculations. She is a womanist scholar who understands that the community of Black folks is more than what we do here in the United States. It is the Black Atlantic, and it is rich in its depths, sex, sexuality, the shades of color. Therefore, it is part of all of our lives, regardless of nationality, race, or ethnicity. How do we, then, commit ourselves to the survival and wholeness of entire peoples? She is a womanist scholar who loves music, dance, the moon, the spirit, food and roundness, the struggle, the folk, and herself, because she knows that the act of loving must have a radical witness in life and in scholarship. She is a womanist who dwells in the deep richness of purple, be it a field in nature or exploring how religion and culture can spark outright orneriness to not only survive, but to thrive in the face of structures of evil. Dr. Thomas is a cherished colleague and friend, and I am honored to introduce her for this last Nathaniel Taylor lecture, entitled Anthropology, Mission, and the African Woman, a Womanist Theological Approach, and to ask you to join us for the conversation to follow after her lecture. Please join me in welcoming who womanist ethicist Katie Geneva Cannon calls a water walker in the life of the Academy and the Church, who spins new meanings out of our journeys of faith through an imaginative womanist anthropological paradigm, heaving deep and rich breaths of hope for a future that is a new heaven and earth for us all, and the will to work for it. Dr. Thomas.
You go, girl.
Good morning. Anthropology, mission, and the African woman. I come to the task of understanding and analyzing mission from a hermeneutic of plurality. I work from my many contexts, and thus I consider myself a multidisciplined scholar. I approach this project first from my social location. I am a black woman, but with the juxtaposition of being an African American Christian woman ordained in the United Methodist Church. I am called to the Missio Dei, the mission of God, to evangelize, to witness to Christ's presence. I work necessarily from a place of tension and complexity, a hermeneutic of plurality. Adding right on to my list, I approach the work as an African American ordained Christian theologian in the womanist tradition. Enough said, you already know that I'm an anthropologist. All of that informs how I approach this work of mission. In this lecture, I use an ethnographic methodology to examine what second, third, fourth, and fifth generation African Christians have to say about mission on their continent. Missio Dei so often comes from what we know as the Great Commission. That is Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. Words, by the way, which do not appear in the passage itself. The commission, as interpreted in the West, commands Christians to go all over the world telling people about their God and teaching Western ways. This approach to entering a new community, culture, or religion does not work with my approach to do anthropology and mission. Rather, the method I use, both for understanding Missio Dei and conducting research, better fits with Luke's version of Missio Dei, found in Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, and chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Here, Jesus sends the disciples out not with an agenda of telling about Jesus. No, he sends his disciples with no bag, no food, not much at all. Jesus sends them out not to call people to receive Christ. Quite contrarily, Jesus sends them to stand at the door of the stranger, both hungry and tired, with the hope that the good people of the house or the street will receive them, feed them, and save the disciples from the elements. This is the approach I take as a theologian trained in anthropology. In my work, I am missionized, a concept to which I will return later in this lecture. I come to persons and communities in diaries and songs of Africans in order to listen. As an anthropologist, I cannot be a member of the community. I am a guest, privileged to privilege the voices of Africans and their histories of Christian mission. I do not look to the colonists or European priests. I look to the people who did not need to file reports detailing how many people they baptized. I listen closely to the voices that can save me and you from repeating the inexcusable violence that so dominates what we call Missio Dei. Let each of us be missionized today. I rely on sources whose voices respect the pluralities and dynamism of African religiosity, culture, and philosophy. More specifically, I privilege those voices that for far too long have not and are not yet given the authority due them. We will be missionized today by the voices of African women. Critical liberation theology, and may I dare say Jesus, speak theological truth to power in the streets, the AIDS clinic, the battlefield, all those places we see on mission advertisements, on glossy fundraising posters, all those places we pretend are over there. My training and my experience of the Spirit of God compel me to give authority to the voices and experiences of those trapped by structures that cause perpetual poverty and pervasive oppression. The last time I checked, that's who Jesus was. He did not reach down to the poor, he was poor. A subtle difference overlooked for millennia. Today, the statisticians tells us that African women are at the top of the list of the bottom, that is. Of the United Nations list of most impoverished nations and people, women across the continent of Africa top the list of the most poor, least educated, and those who have lowest access to power, political, domestic, economic, social, and simply the power to turn on a light bulb. As Cameroonian theologian Louise Tapa puts it, the African woman, quote, incarnates the mass of the poor and the oppressed, unquote. How right she is, for these are the facts. 58% of women living in sub-Saharan Africa have HIV/AIDS. Yesterday I talked about South Africa. Today I'm talking about the whole continent. So 58% of women living in sub-Saharan Africa have HIV/AIDS. 40% of pregnant women in Botswana have been infected with HIV or are living with full-blown AIDS. In some countries, the ratio of infection in girls and boys is as high as 6 to 1. 6 girls infected for every boy. During the Civil War in Liberia, men raped at least 40% of Liberian women. According to the UN, rape and sexual slavery have been one of the most common war crimes. Women who become pregnant as a result were frequently turned to the street, rejected by their husbands, and ostracized by families. The World Health Organization launched a major program to reach thousands of women in North Darfur in an effort to learn the extent of rape crimes. Every single girl or woman had been raped by a man, often men, or they knew someone who had been raped. The World Health Organization reports rape as a crime of terror and states that no girl or woman is safe. The World Health Organization has named the rates of death while giving childbirth an invisible epidemic in Africa. In Africa and elsewhere, women are 100 times more likely to die in childbirth than in wealthy countries like the United States. This startling number increases with the World Health Organization report that only 50% of deaths during childbirth are reported. Theologian Tapa recognizes the Jesus of the Gospels not as a man reaching down to help these poor people. Instead, she proclaims that Jesus is one of, quote, those poor people, one of those African women, unquote. The same spirit of Jesus is the same spirit of African women. That is where God may be found in most radical suffering. Tapa states, quote, I believe that when the African woman has really come to understand the message of liberation that Jesus bears, she will be able to take her brothers by the hand and lead them to the way of liberation that is ours, unquote. To whom do we listen? To whom do we look to missionize us? Well, today we listen to the women of Africa in order that we too might be liberated and saved from the historic malpractice of Missio Dei. I'd like to spend a little time defining liberation. Christians, well-intended for the most part, have erred sometimes to understand and devote their lives to Missio Dei. A close read of just about any classic theology, so-called orthodox theology, supports the notion of Missio Dei as being one of telling, curing, saving, doing something to people who believe differently about the cosmos and all that is in it. At the end of the day, historic Missio Dei and my colleagues' one trip to google.com will indicate that historic includes yesterday and right now. At the end of the day, Missio Dei has been about telling others that we have the keys to the kingdom. They have got to get on board with the program, and we will teach them. All we need are a few Bibles, some guns, sexually transmitted diseases, Western social structures, education, proper clothing, oppressive sexual mores, and patriarchal church structures. When I listen to those whose continent has been cut up by well-intentioned Christians, cut apart in ways that cause famine, I hear movement. I hear the spirit of African women, no less the spirit of God, moving out from under the systemic poverty, sexism, and racism that were planted inside the missionizing churches. I hear a movement. I've witnessed it in South Africa, a movement of liberation. Today, Missio Dei must have liberation at its core. It is, of course, the message in which our scriptures are soaked. Biblically, from Isaiah to Luke to Revelation, the history of the people of God is one of a God who liberates. In Trinitarian language, it is the work of the Spirit to liberate. The Spirit creates, liberates, and sustains. Ruach never stops making something new or making something happen. The question at hand is, who among us will slow down enough to listen to this good news? Or who among us will sit at the feet of the women of Sudan, of Chad, of Uganda, or of Nigeria to hear their good news? The good news must identify most plainly with liberation. The Spirit liberates. That is her vocation. She liberates from unjust situations and systems. Unjust situations and systems try to contain the unruly spirit and her people. Such systems and structures erect barriers and perpetuate violence toward women. They deny that women's bodies reflect the image of God, that humanity's essential power is to create, to generate, to produce and reproduce. Unjust situations and systems cannot contain the Spirit indwelling. In Hebrew, she is Ruach, the God who continually creates life anew. According to the priestly tradition, all it took was her breath to call the cosmos into being. The creeds give her the giver of life, the maker, the poet of life. In Greek, pneuma, spirit, is the source of Jesus' power to restore life. Indeed, pneuma resurrected him. When he expired and breathed his last, the spiritus in Latin inspired his dry bones by inspiring with him. The Spirit, the liberator, has and does exterminate the situations and systems that fear new creation brought by conspiracy. The Spirit of God keeps going and going and going, overturning tables, often in temples, and healing on the Sabbath in spite of our erected churches. This is scary stuff for any neatly packaged evangelistic mission trip. The Spirit demands liberation, and she lives in us. Ghanaian theologian Mercy Amba Odoyuye sees clearly and writes, quote, "All limitations to the fullness of life envisioned in the Christ event ought to be completely uprooted," unquote. She appropriates to her context in Ghana these words that Jesus appropriated from Isaiah. Let us receive her words, be missionized by this African woman whose breath speaks the words of a liberative Missio Dei. She writes, "The poor will hear good news. Those who are depressed will feel the comfort that stimulates action. Those who are oppressed will be encouraged and enabled to free themselves. Abilities rather than disabilities will be what count. All who are blind to their own and others' oppression will come to new insights, and God will pardon all at the Jubilee. It will be a new beginning for all." I want to spend a few minutes talking about a theoretical notion, which I call the concept of the African woman. The spirit that is God is the same spirit that blends herself within our tissues and tendons to wrap up her life with ours. The transcendent spirit that creates heaven and earth is also immanent, indwelling, and indivisible from our midst. The immanent spirit is multicultural, multivalent, and multifaceted. This makes the spirit elusive, hard to define, and very unconventional. Situations and systems that prefer restrictive order would do well to learn that the Spirit is not monomorphic. She moves from and in person to person, dwelling with the shaft and the wheat. As a womanist theologian and anthropologist, I witness the plurality of the Spirit across vastly different social contexts. I witness the plurality of the Spirit in the grand array and the grand variety of African women. There is no monolithic African woman. Kenyan ethicist Nyambura Njagoriti writes, quote, "African women theologians have acknowledged that there is nothing like the African woman. Rather, there are broad influences in Africa that condition women's lives with varying degrees of success," unquote. The Spirit dwells in African women, but does not control or constrict the person or power of any African woman. Indeed, spirit and body conspire to create diversity. The Missio Dei must not only understand, but also honor the Imago Dei made manifest across the diverse cultures of Africa. All African women are made in the image of God. In the words of African women theologians and ethicists in the Circle of Concerned African Women, the Missio Dei is best defined or is best fulfilled when it examines, quote, the social, economic, and political situation in Africa through women's experiences, unquote. Thus, my approach to missiology recognizes that the transcendent spirit finds expression creatively and eminently in the vast array of beliefs, customs, and ways of knowing among African women. Likewise, the transcendent spirit knows intimately that economic, political, and social situations oppress African women and do violence to the imago Dei that is each African woman. Oppression of African women is transgeographical. Oppression of African women is oppression of God's own image and energy. So how do I fashion a theory for doing a womanist approach to mission? Let me begin. A womanist approach to mission employs Alice Walker's definition of womanist in her text, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. That definition, laid out in 4 parts, suggests that a womanist is both bold and audacious, as well as courageous and willful. Womanists know what it takes to have their voices heard in culture and religious environment that does not want to hear the truth that a womanist has to tell. A womanist appreciates the variety of life in our world and also sees that nature is created. It is a construct with power. A womanist loves her whole body as it bears the image of God. She owns her sexuality. A womanist expresses freely a range of emotional feelings and chooses intentionally to live as a relational being. With all that she has to do, a womanist loves herself enough to make it a priority to take care of herself. Finally, womanist is different from feminism. In the words of Walker, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. A womanist theologian, then, privileges the voices, gives authority to the perspective and experience of women of African descent. So in this talk, the focus is on African women who are some of the most impoverished and powerful women in our world. The approach to mission is to be missionized, to listen to the testimony, to witness the Spirit of God in action, and to resist the desire to proclaim, tell, or contest. We must be saved by these women and through their experience as the hands and the feet of the Lord, in whose name we have forcibly baptized. These women know a thing or two about insurrection, resurrection, and life everlasting. They survive and subvert systems with wisdom and courage that shock and awe. My role as a womanist theologian and anthropologist, then, is to release the voices of those stories which are untold. And now the suppression of the African women's voices. Diverse African women denounce the daily experience of systematic oppression. Scholars in the Circle of Concerned African Women call for resistance and proclaim liberation. Writers in a book entitled Groaning in Faith, African Women in the Household of God, say this, quote, "In the deep pain of exclusion, domination, and marginalization, we have the voices of wise women urging us to speak and tell our stories, for which we alone hold the copyright," unquote. Kenyero and Njegoji in this book bring the voices of African women in East and Southern Africa to the public sphere so that others will come to know, quote, the double reality of pain and faith experienced on the continent of Africa, unquote. African culture and Christian religion live in relationship, often tenuous, often salvific. Secular and sacred influence one another. On paper, that may sound like a positive movement towards syncretism in the best sense of the word. The authors of this book expose the double edge of the culture-religion dynamic. Like attracts like. Non-liberating cultural values, which are oppressive to women, meet like notions in religion to increase rhetoric that restricts, represses, and reinforces systems that do violence to the imago Dei of African women. Too often, the combined power structures preach and teach the historically entrenched notion that women's imago Dei is a little bit dimmer than men's. The imago Dei of African women will not allow such destructive teaching to remain. The spirit, imago Dei, embodied in African women, supplies the power to proclaim a different version of the good news. That any oppressive religion and cultural system or situation is simply wrong. As outlined earlier, this is where the spirit transcendent and immanent does her work. African women gather to contest, conjure, conspire, and call on the Spirit of God, who has already started the work. The authors of this book offer a collection of African women who show that acting to insurrect, acting to resurrect, to inspire in spite of what missionaries in union with the church has taught. Women can look elsewhere for the good news, to Isaiah, Jesus, and even to African scholar Mercy Amba Odoyuye. There is power, the power that created the heavens and earth, the power of the Spirit that dwells inextricably in her people in the prophecy. The word promises that the poor will finally hear good news, that the oppressed will free themselves, that oppressors will find a new way, and that it is time for the Jubilee. That is the good news that these African women authors claim can inspire new ways of relating, give power to refuse to accept oppression and indignity, and give birth to faith communities, koinonia African style. And so now I want to share with you some African scholars' reflections about missionaries and the impact of Christian mission in Africa. Let us hear now some of the voices of African persons and what they have to tell us about the history and experience of Christian mission. I begin with a story I first heard from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a third-generation African Christian, and from whom I heard this story from Randall Robinson, an African-American lawyer, author, and former head of Trans-Africa. Now pay attention because it's a very short story, and I'm sure that some of you have heard it before. It goes like this. When the missionaries came to us, we had the land and they had the Bibles. We reverently bowed our heads to pray. When we concluded our prayer and looked up, we had the Bibles and the missionaries had the land. This parable tells the truth the way parables tend to do, by shocking listeners from their comfort zone and rousing the cozy out of tradition. I find myself amazed at the resistance toward listening to the truth in such narratives. In many Christian communities, this parable would be considered exaggeration, created only for shock value, dismissed as angry hyperbole, and simply fictional. The last time I checked, the Jesus of parables and the parables of Jesus met more than a fair share of resistance. The power of narrative is the way the story speaks truth to power. In the rich tradition of African American literature, fiction most certainly tells the truth. Our question, then, is what does the painful past reveal about the ecclesiastical tendency to systematically oppress the imago Dei, expressed differently from the image idol created in the minds and from the context of the missionaries? What would happen if we truly, truly listened and considered the narrative and the authoritative word that trumps our own? As I suggested earlier in this lecture, time has come for us to listen. Christian missionaries simply talk too much. For a decade or so, it has been in scholarly circles quite in vogue to talk, ironically, about the need to listen and to care about the voices of the other, in this case, African persons. How then do we actually listen, as happened that first Pentecost, when we come with the goal to tell, proclaim, and call African persons to realize that our way is the only way? Ultimately, and this travels far beyond the field of mission, ultimately, we who wield Christian mission theories and practice do not listen with the intent of being transformed and changed ourselves by what the other has to say. The history of Christian mission provides vivid evidence of the way that listening rarely equates structural transformation. More plainly, the history of Christian mission provides vivid evidence that what we call listening is a way we talk a good story. If we are listening with an agenda, with firm resolve and definite conviction, we cannot honestly call that listening, can we? Perhaps we need to listen in order to be missionized. Let us listen to the words of Dr. Ogbu Kalu, a third-generation Nigerian Christian who is the Henry Winters Luce Professor of World Christianity and Mission at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. Kalu's seminal article entitled Church Presence in Africa, a historical analysis of the evangelization process, clearly locates the problem in missionary history. Kalu writes, quote, "Missionary history was and still is being written by missionaries and their proteges who have swallowed missionary ideology hook, line, and sinker. Missionary history is propagandistic and unanalytical," unquote. Already we hear a harsh critique of one who received many benefits from the mission movement, but who personally knows the cost extracted. Kalu argues that missionary history produced a literary genre that, quote, focused on how the gospel came to different parts of Africa, but ignored the social, economic, and political background of the host communities, unquote. Moreover, Kalu asserts that, quote, the history of Christianity in Africa is not only what missionaries did or did not do, but also what Africans thought about what was going on and how they responded, unquote. It is this second point that gives a concrete lesson for those doing a liberative mission approach. According to Kalu, such an approach should, quote, analyze the inner dynamics of the evangelization process, perceiving that process as an encounter between viable cosmologies and cultures. This method rejects European Christianity as the starting point of African church history. On the contrary, Africa and its cultures constitute the starting point, unquote. A third lesson is to acknowledge and appreciate the alive universe of various African peoples. For example, anthropologist Ara S. Rattray does a remarkable job in describing the Ghanaian Ashanti religion and culture depicted in Ashanti cosmology. He presents a vibrant cosmology with an elaborate social order. When missionary history overlooks or discounts these worldviews and cosmologies, the history is misleading, if not fictitious. Kalu also contends that, quote, missionaries came not only with various European and American cultural values, but with an identifiable ideology characteristic of their age, unquote. While Barrowhouse and Lefevre, in their book, The Responsible Church and Foreign Mission, contend that missionary goals and aims differed, Kalu describes a unified ideology at the beginning of the missionary enterprise. He writes this, quote, though the Portuguese pretended to be looking for a mystical kingdom of Priester John and were inspired by the scientific advances of the Renaissance, their main aim was economic, and their view of Africans was racist, unquote. Finally, Kalu advances a salient point which is especially noteworthy for those of us who desire to learn from past mistakes. He says, quote, missionaries came to Africa with an amazing degree of confidence in the supremacy of Christianity and the European social and economic order. They came with the certainty that they were obeying the great command to go into all the world, baptizing and making disciples of all nations. Such a sense of certainty often produces hard-headed insensitivity toward indigenous cultures, unquote. Is it possible to fulfill the Great Commission and have sensitivity toward and respect of indigenous cultures? Yes, it is if one loses her or his own cultural confidence and claims only the faithfulness to the gospel. Now the question is this even possible? Professor Musa Dube of Botswana thinks not. She writes from her own hermeneutic of plurality. Dube is an African Christian woman, New Testament scholar, and identifies herself as post-colonial and feminist. Through these multiple dimensions, she finds clarity. She argues convincingly that imperialism is in play whenever a dominant nation imposes economic, political, and cultural institutions upon foreign one. Dube contends that mission is an imported cultural institution, and as such, quote, it is important to determine whether its strategies advocate power relations that resonate with the model of liberating interdependence or embrace a model consistent with imperialistic impositions, unquote. The bold and audacious character of womanist theology and the critical eye of anthropology lead me to argue that mission cannot escape imperialistic tendencies. In other words, mission as we know it bears a striking resemblance to imperialistic imposition. Mercy Amba Odoyuye examines missionaries' inability to understand that only those who practice indigenous religions and rituals can make a judgment about their modification and or their usefulness. Africans themselves have the ultimate responsibility for evaluating their use. As I hear this African woman scholar who trained at Cambridge University speak, I believe that perhaps we could come closer together if the missionizers would turn over their mission and listen to the breath, wind, and spirit that speaks through the language, culture, and religion of African people, who, by the way, are created in the very image of what is most holy. Now I want to return to the Lucan model of mission. If we listen to Jesus instruct his disciples, we do not even need to bring Jesus. In Luke's account, the disciples embarked on a very radical and far more Jesus-like mission. They go out as beggars. They have nothing to give. They are not teachers nor proselytizers. They go out to encounter God's kingdom in ways quite unorthodox. The disciples can only hope that someone in the street or in the house will receive them in mercy and with grace. The disciples have to rely on others. The disciples do not bring God to others. No introduction is necessary. God greets them at the door. The word comes to them when a stranger outside the gate says, "I have some extra bread if you're hungry." The disciples' work has nothing to do with changing others and everything to do with changing themselves. We do not create the kingdom. We receive it when we are invited and just when we are invited and just as we are, accepted by the imago Dei of a stranger who offers to wash our dirty feet. We do not build the kingdom by convincing African women to give up honoring ancestors. We glimpse the kingdom when we listen to the word spoken through and see the image of God in women living in Africa. The Missio Dei is in our midst precisely when we forget our bag with Jesus in it. In the parabolic way Jesus prefers to teach, the disciples go to new towns and meet new people, not to change, but to be changed, not to tell, but to listen, not with power, but helpless. Jesus' approach to Missio Dei is far less complicated and far more demanding. We have to live an ethic of koinonia, welcoming, receiving, and experiencing the word and cherishing the imago Dei in people with whom we do not particularly have anything in common. We receive a glimpse of the very Missio Dei from the pluralities of imago Dei and the multiple expressions of spirit offered by women of African descent. We experience mission possible. And in conclusion, today I have examined mission from the hermeneutic of plurality. My social location as an African American womanist theologian and anthropologist informs my understanding of Missio Dei. Most importantly, my understanding of the gospel necessitates that I open myself to be missionized as I stand present with others, particularly African women, to understand the amazing way that God in Jesus Christ works in the world. My understanding of the gospel means that I bring a liberation approach to mission as structures impact negatively the lives of African women who are made in God's image. Second, third, fourth, and fifth generation African scholars have raised their voices to say that mission has to take away its imperialism. And I submit that perhaps the best that Missio Dei can do is to influence governments and churches in the first world to be missionized by the liberating work of Jesus Christ, made known to us and the poor, particularly African women. Thank you very much.
Let the conversation begin. There are two mics here and here, and we are asking that if you have a question, wait until the mic person gets to you, because it's being webcast, and unless you're using the mics, people who are watching this on the web won't be able to hear your questions. So if you would just allow that little delay, that would be great. I'm going to let Professor Thomas field her own questions because she is a teacher and knows how to do that. I will simply be the timekeeper.
I have a pencil so I can write down some of the questions. Okay. Okay, I'll start here and there. Thanks.
I have to confess to a little confusion, as particularly with this last lecture, wondering, and I have to say this, I am not a missionary, I am not a scion of missionaries, so I don't think I have a kind of a personal defensiveness, but I wonder if I'm hearing incorrectly, but it seems to me that in your justified critique of, in a sense, Western European missionaries, because they're fellow Christians and we need to judge and correct each other as Christians, that underneath that you seem to be giving a pass to the social, political, economic, cultural patterns of the pre-Christian African societies, which, from what I have read and I think have accurately been, in some cases, described as being really abominable in terms of how they treat women. And that there were strong elements, not perfect, in Christian missions which moved into those societies, and as part of their proclamation of the gospel, of the liberating, saving presence and force of Jesus Christ, moved to reform and change those societies. Not perfectly, not always totally successfully, but really a part of the history which I don't think I was hearing in your presentation. Am I totally incorrect and unhearing?
Thank you for your question. Because if that's what you think, then I really want to clarify what it is that I'm saying. I know that many of the African cultures, particularly as it relates to women, have been extremely oppressive. That is where I said in my lecture that like attracts like. And when I said that, I meant that the oppressive features of African cultures comes to meet some of the oppressiveness within Christianity. So that combination makes it doubly oppressive for African women. Okay? So I am not at all negating pre-Christian patriarchy. I know that it existed. And I am being absolutely clear that that's why I think Christianity could gel in some ways with some of the patriarchal structures that were already in place. This is why it's so important, in my view, to listen to African women, because they understand that much better than any outsider can. And I think that people like Mercy Amba Odoyoye very clearly says that it is only people who live in that context that can tell those who are coming in how they can be helpful. And I hear people like Musa Dube saying that Christianity has brought such stressful and imperialistic tendencies that it really undermines what liberation that women can do for themselves. So in my mind, what I am saying is that it's very important to listen to African women. Now, I have an advantage as a woman anthropologist to have entree into women's communities wherever I go. And so it's very easy for me to have conversations with African women, and my strategy is always, when I enter a culture, to do a lot of listening. And believe it or not, when I started my research in South Africa, which is a very complex situation because when you go into that culture, it really feels very much like the United States. And you say, well, what is the problem here? And in Cape Town, it's even more complex because you have a white minority that looks like the majority in many cases in the business section of that culture. But because I was trying to get to people who I felt were impoverished, I had a very difficult time getting to them, particularly as I went through the churches. What I did was begin to have conversations with women who were cleaning the bathrooms, with people who were doing what across cultures is considered to be work that, well, what do we call those people who take out our trash, who mine our children and all of that? That's who I began to talk to, and my whole world changed. And when I gave authority to those voices, my world turned upside down about what they perceived the world to be like and what was needed. And this approach is very biblically based, it seems to me. And I go to the story of the Prodigal Son, and I know all of you know the story. But when the younger son came home and there was a big party, of course, the older son was doing his work in the field. But when he came home, I noticed that he talked to the servants and asked, what is going on here? And the servant could say everything that was going on in detail. And I take my signal from that everywhere I go, if I go to the people who are considered to be the servant, quote unquote, then those folks know what's going on, the so-called non-elites, simply because they have to know in order to survive. They can tell me there's power structures, everything. And then I'm set. so that I say to missionaries that I think you ought not to listen to the people who meet you at the airport exclusively. Those are the people who have the power that has been given to them by the institution. But ultimately, you want to talk to the people who are helping them with their domestic chores and that kind of thing. But too often, we do it the reverse way. So that is what I meant. I hope that that clarifies what your question was. Somewhat. Well, do you want to come back with another question?
Well, it seems to me that you have a picture of the Christian churches in Africa, which seems to be saying that they have absolutely no contact with the poorer masses of the people. They are doing nothing to undermine and change some of those oppressive patterns. And this is not true, I do not believe. Now, they are not achieving grandiose success, but missionaries and African Christians whom I have met have been sensitive to many of these issues you've talked about and who have been addressing them with modest effect, some cases, sometimes with not very much success, but nevertheless working at addressing them, being sensitive to them. Now, I don't get from your presentation any indication that that is true.
Well, I would say this. What I'm trying to do in my lecture is to listen to second, third, fourth, and fifth generation African Christians who have both benefited from the Christian missions, typically in education. I note that Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela went to mission schools. But they are also the people who are saying some of, if not most of, the kinds of structural economic impoverishment that the masses continue to have are a result of the missionaries coming not only with the gospel, but with their oppressive culture. Now, I am sitting on boards and organizations like the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, of which I am a member, and am currently the chair of the Women's Commission. Now, when I am in rooms with these women, this is what I'm hearing, and Musa Dube has written this. So I can only say that, yes, I think it's both and, but because I think the church continues to send missionaries out with an old way of doing things, I think it's very important for myself in this context to bring this kind of lecture so people can continue to re-examine how they're doing their work. It is a point for asking, are we being missionized? That is the point of the lecture. When I go to South Africa and to the continent, I come back changed in some very important ways. And so I want to hear stories of missionaries talking about, well, how am I being changed? How am I coming back to this country trying to impact what my government is doing to continue the oppressive economic policies that go on in Africa? What am I doing about AIDS in this country to influence this government to say that it's ridiculous to require that people use condoms and then we'll give them the drugs? That's what I'm asking about.
Well, I just have to say to you that the pattern that you are calling for missionaries, quote, maybe from the West, the advanced countries, to be like in their relationships with the people there and in their bringing messages back is precisely what I have experienced over several generations of contact with missionaries. Not all, not perfectly, but definitely not as clueless as you seem to be portraying them.
Thank you. I'm happy to hear that. Yes, I see your hand.
I'm Jim Swain, former overseas worker in Northwest India in Punjab, from Methodist Church, United Methodist Church. And I would like to thank you for saying what you said. I think it does need to be said here. I think your qualifications of it are quite accurate. And my work was with students in MA program in English, and I taught English, American, and Indian literature in English. Curiously enough, I tried in a seminary here to make my dissertation on Indian writing in English, but I was told that that was not important enough and not written about enough. That was not this seminary, it was the University of Chicago Divinity School. You believe it? I don't. Anyway, I wanted to ask a question which is a little different. At the beginning of your talk, and off and on since, you've used the word aesthetic, as though one aspect of our attempt to relate in a Christian manner to folks involved a certain receptiveness, a certain openness, and a certain objectivity, which one would associate with the work of an artist. I think you're right, but I may be prejudiced because I'm a poet myself, or at least I try to be. And but my experience of it has been that this is a rhythm, that there is, as Robert Frost used to suggest, an enfolding moment, and a moment by yourself, and then a repeat, and so on and so forth, trying to find out where people are. This is exactly what I found myself doing with students. Youngsters, for example, whose family would have them marry by arrangement, which is fine by me, since that's the way people did things. And I know some missionaries whose kids did that, as a matter of fact. But here we are, we need to discuss how you want to do this. And then I find that some of the students are making experiments. You don't have to insult your parents by not letting them pick out your spouse. One thing you can do is to take your spouse, the girl, the man that you're interested in, around to meet your parents. And that's exactly what several couples did in the MA program in Guru Nanak Dev University, where I was teaching. And I think that the problem is an emphasis on Jesus, which is un-Jesus-like, which I appreciated your saying. Jesus was talking, if I understood him correctly, through the mesh of Scripture that we read together in various ways, was talking about the kingdom of God. He was not talking about Jesus. Whatever else was added to that, it has a strong component of people talking about Jesus. So if you can rest in the assurance of the accuracy of that fact, and rest in the assurance also of the accuracy that there is something in the word Christ which Jesus points to as a beyond, and so does every other individual amongst us, then I think that we're close to home on the business of missions. Missions indicates that God's people are sent to one another in whatever form God makes them in the place in which you find them.
Amen.
Well, I really don't want to make a speech, but I do want to make a comment before I ask a question, and that is to thank you for a marvelous set of lectures. I've been coming down to YDS for pretty regularly for 48 years since I've left here in 1959, and you have delivered for my thinking, one of the most marvelous set of lectures I've heard in 48 years. Now, I'll borrow Alice Walker's imagery. Your lectures were beautiful. But now to my question. Yesterday you talked about the authority of the Bible and whether it can indeed have authority in South Africa, particularly for women. And I was thinking after I left here and went home that probably your question is applicable to many cultures. Certainly, while you dramatized the situation, you spoke of South Africa and how dramatically that represents the oppression of women. That's not the only place where women are oppressed. And so therefore your question is quite apt. What authority does the Bible have in all cultures where women are oppressed? That's a wonderful question. I'm not troubled by that, really, because I'm not a biblicist. For me, Alice Walker, T.S. Eliot, Carl Sandburg, James Agee are speaking the Word of God as much as anyone in the Bible. So that doesn't bother me. I'm not a biblicist. It got me in trouble for a number of years in my church because I was that way. But anyway, I just want to raise the question of, do you think what you're asking vis-a-vis Africa, particularly women, is applicable to the question of the authority of the Bible everywhere?
You have demonstrated in your question exactly the reason I love anthropology. I was being particular, but I meant universal. Okay, that's why I always begin with the particular, and that's what anthropology helps me to do. And I think that that's what liberation theologies have done too. They begin with a particular context, but the questions that are raised have, I believe, universal application. So of course I think that all women have to look at this, because even I, and it's a question that I had to ask myself and constantly ask myself, but because before I went to Union Theological Seminary and had my first Hebrew Bible lecture from Phyllis Tribble, I subjugated myself to men because it was biblical, because I understood that that is how God meant it to be. And then I heard Phyllis Tribble raise some questions, and I got very angry. And then my anger began to be fused into scholarship, so that now that I'm here, I can raise this question broadly to have all of us think about it together. I don't know what the answer is, because, quite honestly, I am compelled by the life and work of Jesus Christ. And that is what moves my life. And I don't intend to give that up. But at the same time, it is his life and ministry, particularly who he decided to be with, that forces me to raise these questions. And it certainly gives me great passion for how I move as an anthropologist, and how the anthropology then infuses my theology to bring the particular set of lectures that I have this week. Yes.
I'm glad you just said what you said, because as one of the oldest women here, class of 1950, I went... We went through the fires of pre-ordination, which is a very special time. You're a good bit younger. But, and I think that my generation has, for example, they say that modern medicine is 20 years old. So I'm thinking about the time that you're talking about of our brothers and sisters who were missionaries in Africa, that we have had the advantage of a Yale education, which was not only in theology but in science. And I think understanding men and women, as Carol Gilligan said at Harvard, men and women are very different, but we're very much more alike because we're human. And as humans, we have lived through periods of time where the Spirit has given us more understanding. So I would just like to hear you comment on where we are in time in the world of God's Spirit in terms of understanding what we're like and therefore being able to understand what Jesus Christ taught us to preach about.
I'm going to take that question as it relates to this last lecture in particular. I agree that we have come a long way, maybe in how we're doing mission, and certainly having educated clergy from very fine institutions now being on boards that make decisions about how mission is done does make a difference. However, I'm also aware that there are denominations that do not require theological education, and that there are what I might consider to be conservative movements even within our own denominations. In my own denomination, I just received word that the head of the Board of Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church was fired suddenly, escorted out of the God box by the police, and removed from that position. Why? Because I think he was trying to do what I was talking about. Okay, his name is Randy Day. He is one of my best friends. We went to South Africa together for the first time. So here he is doing the exact thing that I've been talking about. And what happened? Fired, escorted from the building. This was 2 days ago. So that where I think that there are tensions within our denominations about how we want to do things. I think that there are people who very much want to go back to 20 years ago to how things were. And this has to do with power. So that my lecture comes just to remind those of us who are doing it the right way that we have to be vigilant, that we have to know that this motto of doing ministry, that we do it the right way, just sit back and do what we say needs to be done, is important. And I'm saying that we need to be very intentional and remember that we can move backwards very quickly. And power and money, my sister is saying. I think you're right. So that's what I'm thinking. Okay. Back there.
In this last lecture, you talked about the power of listening, and you talked about the power of listening and how effective it is as praxis in the kind of work that you describe. And certainly as a woman and as a womanist, you have an entree into communities in a way that many persons will not. But can you talk a little bit about the process of listening, how you encounter perhaps language barriers, cultural barriers, or even the baggage of American empire, how that listening may not be as, I'm thinking that listening in my own experience, it hasn't been as simple as sitting down, but that there are processes that I continually have to go through in questioning myself, and how I question or approach the other to talk about their stories.
Okay. I'd be happy to talk about how I listen. The beauty of anthropology, which is certainly a discipline that has had its own problems, to state it briefly, but just to acknowledge it. I find the tools to be very helpful because it is an inductive methodology. Ethnography is an inductive methodology. And what I try to do with the inductive methodology is what I call participatory leading, participant-led research. In other words, I went to the community that I did my research, and then I said, I'm here, what would you find helpful for me to do? And then I listen, I draft questions, and then I go back and say, how are these questions? And then, it's say back and forth, back and forth. And then I do a test to see if the questions make sense. Now, this research, and one of the reasons I don't get to do it as much as I'd like to is because it requires money to hire people who speak the languages. When I was living in South Africa, I took Xhosa at the University of Cape Town's African Language Department. Now, because I'm not there, I've lost a lot of it, but certainly engaging any culture means that you have to know that language. That's the first thing, because so much of the signs and symbols is embedded in the language. And learning the language means that you're taking the people very seriously. So that's the first thing. And so I was gifted with the same research assistant that Dr. Mempela Renpela had to do research. And so she navigated everything, and I listened to everything she said. And in fact, she was probably the chief informant. So I privileged her voice, and she took me places I could not have gotten to. So, in other words, my inductive methodology means that I listened and was led by people in a way that freed me up and put them in the driver's seat. Now, it's very important to know that if you read my book, Under the Canopy, I think it's the second chapter that talks about my knowledge that even with doing that, I still have power because I have the pen. Okay, so there has to be a continued commitment to privilege the voices of those people who I'm learning from. And that, it takes a lot of work. It also means that I open my resources, the real resources of my family and my life, to this community. So it means that I have an ongoing family in South Africa to whom I have commitment. Okay? And they let me know what's going on, and that means that, yes, I send money. Yes, I have asked my church to educate members of their families. Yes, my church in Chicago has physically gone to the church in Cape Town. And so there's all of this ongoing commitment rather than this thing that I got my research, and, thank you very much. No. My entire family has gone to the township, to the church, and it just means it's a lifetime commitment. And I'm trying to prepare to go in January '09. I wish that I could live there, in terms of my passion, but it also means that I'm obligated, once I am back here with these resources, to give a lecture like this. I mean, it's not just that, I just put this on the shelf. It means that now, if this is the arena that I find myself in, how do I share this information? How do I do it in a way that helps other people to at least hear the story? And then it's a process of letting it go. I have no idea if anything will happen as a result of what I've done here. But I think that some people have been impacted and that I have to release it. So that's what I mean by listening. It's listening when I'm in the context in a way that people direct what I'm doing, but it is taking action once I'm back here in my own context and in the work that I find myself doing. Yes, ma'am. Guess who's asking a question?
Thank you, genuinely and deeply. Having had the privilege of being in this room for some 56 years, I'm tremendously conscious of the presence of some very great people with whom I have had decades of association. And next year, this gentleman and I will have been friends 60 years.
Yes.
And he's devoted his life to missions from beginning to end. So I would be hungry to know what his questions are. I also am keenly aware that there are those of you who came out of the student movement in this room. One of the ladies over there has headed Church Women United, founded in 1941 in the midst of the developing World War II. And Bishop Talbot, where'd he go? His wife also headed Church Women United. And I've seen the color and gender barrier broken in this room from 1956, the first person of color from Ceylon then. 1955, James Robinson, the first African American to give a Beecher lecture. And Phyllis Tribble, of course, the first woman to give a Beecher lecture. But I'd like to almost confess my journey and get your comments. My devotion when I came to this place was the student YM and YWCA. We were one then as a student movement. And it had been my goal to be a secretary of a YWCA at a major college in the Midwest. But life had its turns, and I ended up in the East, and there were no student YWCAs here. There was something called a student Christian movement, etc. But as I say to friends that are dear to me, no one ever told me you could work as a volunteer and not even get paid for it. And that I began to do in 1959. As the turbulent 60s entered, I found myself on the administrative committee of the National Board of the YWCA, and eventually I was its chair as the revolution in civil rights began to peak. I was as well advisor to the local NAACP Youth Council. Many of the members of the Youth Council were children of privileged blacks, poor blacks, but many of them affluent, Jewish, dedicated, socialist, and progressive persons. One of those parents wrote a letter saying, just before the summer of 1964, please write everybody and ask for protection for my son and daughter and others who are going to Mississippi for the summer. And here I'm humbled by the presence of a gentleman, now a UCC executive, who shared with me the story how as a teenager he challenged the structure, policy, and practice and commitment of his elders and his church when they refused Bob Moses the right to do the work that he had gone there to do. Anyway, I wrote everybody. I wrote senators, all the senators, the President of the United States, the Attorney General, and so forth. And strangely enough, they responded. But one of the people did not respond, and that was Senator James O. Eastland. Mm-hmm. And the person, it was more than fortuitous because My mother, who did not rear me on her first visit in 1957, said that she had worked in his home as a cook. And when Fannie Lou Hamer escalated into the international scene, I asked my family if they knew her. They said, of course, Ruleville is small. And my mother told me later that she had been a laundress in the Eastland household when Mrs. Townsend was the laundress. And so as I look back, I realize that as we ask for protection, less than 10 days later, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were murdered. But they were only part of the spectrum of murders that were taking place in this country when people challenged the power structure. And I think it's significant because Mrs. Schwerner was a teacher in our high school, and both our sons had been taught biology by her. Dr. Carolyn Goodman was the mother of Andrew, the youngest of the group. And later I would come, as we held Martin Luther King services in New York and invited those three families to be our special guests, I would come to know more intimately the Cheney family. But what I am, as one who shares an anthropological past and interest, the challenge is that the people who responded and who took the greatest initiative were Jewish, and there were many others who suffered greatly from the Midwest. Berg, I just communicated with him a few weeks ago. And of course, there are those 40 who are memorialized in Montgomery who paid the ultimate sacrifice for the change that took place. And many of those people in SNCC were unchurched. Yesterday morning, as I went to brush my teeth, which I did not do in Mississippi, I met a lady, and I told her of my great love and respect for SNCC, and she says, oh yes, my mother was a member. And she said, but of course, I was not interested in what she was doing. I wanted to know what we're having for dinner, but it was very great to be with her. And in that presence was also the first, perhaps, American Chinese person from the state of Mississippi who also said that she had been a part of the movement. And I wonder, how does it happen that the catalysts are so often not a part of the religious institutional church?
I want to thank you for giving that rich, rich history, because I can only be standing here in part because I stand on your shoulders and all who made the path. I also want to acknowledge that there are many, many people who have joined the struggle for liberation in this country and all over the world, who are of many, many hues. And so I think that that's very important, that I know that my allies are in the room now and have been here across the years. So I thank each of you for that. I think that the question that you've asked, which is why are some of the people who've been involved in movements of liberation outside the walls of the institutional church, is precisely because of some of the things that I raised in this final lecture. Because some people recognize that the church is so embedded with the culture and the power structures, and that we have some questions about that. Secondly, I think that, if I may be so audacious, that God's movement is much bigger than one religion. And so I think that spirituality is a far bigger net, so to speak, that catches people who really want to join together to make transformation in this world. And that there are some who recognize that and move to that tune. Some of us are Christians, some of us are Jewish, some of us are other religions. But I know Mahatma Gandhi acts more Christ-like than some Christians, or acted more Christ-like than some Christians. And so it's really about who is about the work of God that makes it possible for all the people to have life and to have meaning and to have free expression as they are made in God's image. So that's my answer, that there's something much bigger going on, and that we want to be moving to whoever. I want to be walking with those people who are about doing justice, and it doesn't matter what their religion is by any stretch of the imagination, nor do I have to give up who I am and what my own faith tradition is to join in with that. Thank you very much. I'll call on Professor Towns.